Good morning, everyone. Today we are examining Isaiah chapters 63 and 64 and looking at some of the lessons that we can learn from what it is that Isaiah has to say here in these chapters. Now, these two chapters are connected as far as their content, but they are somewhat disconnected as far as the messages that they present. Because in the beginning of chapter 63, you have a very different message than what you find at the end of chapter 63 and all the way through chapter 64. Because at the beginning of chapter 63, you have the Lord somewhat giving through Isaiah a question and answer session of who he is and why he does what he does. And it's interesting to note that when you come down to verse 5 of chapter 63, the first thing that I wanted to bring out is in the midst of this little back and forth question and answer that is taking place. And in verse 5, God says, I looked, but there was no one to help, and I wondered that there was no one to uphold. Therefore my own arm brought salvation for me, and my own fury it sustained me. You have a situation where God is talking about his relationship with the people and the fact that when he needed help, there was no one there to help him. He was standing by himself, as it were. Oftentimes we think about the fact that we can look to God for help, and that in times of trouble, God will be there for us. But, when we talk about wanting to be the friend of God and we talk about wanting to have a relationship with God, a relationship is a two-sided element. And so it is not possible for me to truly have a relationship with God if the only one that I'm worried about is whether or not he is there for me. What happens when he's looking to us for help? Well, God doesn't need anything. Yes, he does. He needs someone who's going to stand up for him. He needs someone who is going to uphold the same standards and the same statutes that he is trying to illustrate to mankind even today. He is looking for someone to proclaim his word. He is looking for someone who will stand up for his existence in the face of a world that is increasingly trying to throw him by the wayside. So, when God looks, is there anyone to help? Is the help always expected to go from God to man, or are we going to be there when he needs our help? When he needs someone to stand up for him? When he needs those who are willing to have the same standards, the same morals, the same rationale as he does? It's a very interesting thought to pull out of verse 5. In the second place, when you drop down to verse 9, we see another common thread in this idea of the relationship between God and man. The account has now shifted, beginning in verse 7, to a remembrance or a recognition of the mercy of God. And it states in verse 9, in all their affliction he was afflicted, and the angel of his presence saved them. In his love and in his pity he redeemed them, and he bore them and carried them all the days of old. The key phrase I want to key or hone in on here is in all their affliction, he was afflicted. In other words, in seeing what they were going through, it hurt him. It was an affliction upon him. We sometimes wonder, does God even know? Does God even care? And the answer is yes. And that it impacts him, it afflicts him to see us afflicted. There is no joy, there is no pleasure that is taken out of the problems and the trials and the sufferings that we endure. Instead, in the very same way that a parent suffers when their child suffers, even if the suffering is justified, so it is with God as well. God does not like to see his people suffering. God does not get pleasure out of the hurt of others. Then when you come down to chapter 64, and there's a lot more that we could say. We could spend some time pointing out the fact that he remembered Moses and the relationship that he had with Moses that would cause him to go back and to remember Moses and remember the days of Moses in the way that is talked about in chapter 63. And there toward the end of chapter 63, you have this prayer that Isaiah is going to lay out, and it stretches all the way through chapter 64. And I really want to hone in on for just a moment some of the things that are stated here in chapter 64, beginning in verse number 4. And I don't have time to go into all of the depth of them that I would like to, but there's an extremely powerful statement that is being made beginning in verse number 4. Isaiah says in this prayer to God, "For since the beginning of the world, men have not heard nor perceived by the ear, nor has the eye seen any God besides you, who acts for the one who waits for him. You meet him who rejoices and does righteousness, who remembers you in your ways. You are indeed angry, for we have sinned, and in these ways we continue, and we need to be saved. But we are all like an unclean thing, and all our unrighteousness are like filthy rags. We all fade as a leaf, and our iniquities, like the wind, have taken us away. And there is no one who calls on your name, who stirs himself up to take hold of you, for you have hidden your face from us and have consumed us because of our iniquities. But now, O Lord, you are our Father. We are the clay, and you are potter, and all we are the work of your hand. Do not be furious, O Lord, nor remember iniquity forever. Indeed, please look, we are all your people. Your holy cities are a wilderness. Zion is a wilderness. Jerusalem a desolation. Our holy and beautiful temple, where our fathers praised you, is burned up with fire, and all our pleasant things are laid waste." When you look at these verses, you see the message of sovereignty, that since the beginning of the world, men have not heard nor perceived by the ear, nor has the eye seen any God besides you. He is truly the one who is sovereign, and man has failed. Man has failed because he has sinned. He is like an unclean thing, and all his righteousness is like filthy rags. And yet, God will forgive, but not without consequence. You know, some people think that God forgiving means all of the consequences go away. It doesn't work like that. We still have the consequences that fall for actions that have been taken. And so you have at the end, your holy cities are a wilderness, Zion is a wilderness, Jerusalem a desolation, our holy and beautiful temple where our fathers praised you is burned up with fire, and all our pleasant things are laid waste. You have this very beautiful picture of the sovereignty of God, the unrighteousness and the wickedness that man has presented before him who is holy, the response that has been necessary and that was righteous in its bringing, but then the hope for forgiveness and the hope for tomorrow. Those are things that we can take. And those are things that we can learn from as we strive to serve God today. God will not bat his eye at sin and wickedness. He wants someone who is going to uphold his standards. And he is also one who will forgive. I hope these things have been beneficial to you. I hope they've been helpful to you as you try to understand the messages of chapter 63 and 64. I hope you have other things that maybe I didn't touch on or couldn't go into as much detail on that have helped and benefited you. Tomorrow we will come back and we will examine Isaiah chapter 65. But until then, I hope you have a great day.